Take a look at these shapes and colors. Acid is so fun to mess around with. The best part is it only really takes two nodes, attribute blur and relax. You can even connect the points to make some worms, which I did in my file that you can download. Anyway, let's get into it. First, I'm just going to add in a grid, or something to put some points on. Then I'm going to scatter some points on the grid. And at the moment these points don't really have any structure, they're all pretty random. I want to add some structure by using two nodes, and these two nodes fight with each other, which is even better. So those two nodes are relax, and the relax node pushes points apart. You just need to untick, use normal and the point radius attribute, and you'll see it starts pushing them apart. I'll push them just a little bit, I don't want it to be too crazy, and I'll set it to 1 iteration. And that's going to be the first thing, just pushing the points apart a little bit. The second node that does the opposite of relax is attribute blur. So blur pulls things closer together. So if you set the blur to proximity and you try turning it up a bit, you'll see it pulls everything together. Now for the blur, I set it to max neighbors of 3. And the reason for that is you start getting these curly looking worm shapes that look really cool. But at the moment it doesn't look very interesting. But if you just merge this input with itself, suddenly you get lines out of nowhere. And these lines are kind of the whole idea of how it works. At the moment, this is only doing it once. To get a better result, you can run it every single frame. But first I want to create some kind of emission source from this scatter node. I'm just going to do it manually using a solver. You could probably use a pop sim for this, but I'm just going to do it manually. In this solver, I'm going to take this geometry and just move it up slightly. I'll add in a wrangle, a point wrangle, and set the position to be plus 0.1 every frame. So now that's just going to move it upwards. Now I want to keep a trail of the previous points. To do that, I'm going to need to mark these points as the first ones. What I mean by that is I'll do a group node, set it to points, and I'll set it to start. So now all of these points are in a group called start. And each frame of the solver, I only want to move the start points. I'm going to use a blast node to delete everything that isn't the start points. Set it to that, points, non-selected. That'll isolate just those ones. And now I want to merge in all the other points that I'm about to add. So I'll use a merge node. Merge these two together. And there you go, now you have a trail. But the problem is this is growing really, really fast. We're up to 512,000 points. Every frame, it's growing exponentially more. So 4,000, 8,000, 16,000. But I only want it to be adding a point to the very end of the trail rather than everywhere. To do that, I'm just going to delete the group from anything that doesn't need it, which is everything else. Hopefully this makes sense. I'm just separating out the start points from the trail. So these are the ones that are at the head of the trail. These are the ones that are trailing behind. And if you combine them now, you get this trail. And you're not getting a crazy number of points anymore. So now we just have a simple kind of line of points, which doesn't have much form or structure. But now I want to add in the structure and the form from these two nodes. So I'm going to copy them in and just paste them in here, put them at the bottom. And now you start to get some really interesting shapes. And you can probably see where this is starting to go. We're getting some interesting little streams of particles, and this middle part is a bit thick and dense, but you can reduce that just by reducing the number of points on the scatter node a little bit. And now it gives it a bit more room and you start to see these interesting little shapes. So to make this look a little better, you can always mess with the settings of these two nodes. So it kind of depends on the scene scale, but I had a pretty low radius. I didn't want them to spread too much. Maybe a little bit more than that. Yeah, because you just want these sort of stringy looking shapes. And then for the blur, that pulls them together. So if you want them to look kind of like lines, you can set that lower. But I ended up using something like 1 or 2 iterations, not too many. And I set the neighbors to 3. And if you set the neighbors higher, you can get some kind of interesting cell looking shapes. But I thought the one that looked best was probably 3. 2 looks okay, it looks a bit dotty, but 3 was pretty good. So now, how do you get a more interesting shape? Well, at the moment, they're just going upward because I set them to go upward, but I could set them to go outward doing this, normalize position, and now they should be moving outwards like that. If I multiply that down a tiny bit, like to 0.1, then you start to get these little stringy looking shapes again. And this is pretty much what I did for my final version. So it was this kind of idea. Also on this attribute blur node, if you don't like these stringy patterns and you want to reduce them, you can set it a bit lower, and that's going to give you more dots. If you set it a bit higher, you start to introduce the strings again. And it's good to have a mix of dots and strings, so you might want to set it somewhere in the middle, maybe like 1.5, just to give it a little bit of room to group points, but not so much that it becomes too dotty like this, or too stringy. So now you can make it a little bit faster if you want. You can set it to 0.2. It'll give you a bit more speed. Maybe not, 1.5. Something like that. Then to make it look even more cool, you can add in a bit more random motion. You could do that by doing position plus some noise. Actually, I'll move the noise to a variable called n. 0.1. That'll add in like a little bit more. So at the moment it's changing the y coordinate, and I don't want it to do that, so I'm just going to set the noise y coordinate to 0. That should make it flat. And it's kind of going in one direction only, and that's because it needs to be subtracted 0.5, because noise goes between 0 and 1. If I want it to go into the negative range here, like negative 25, I need to subtract 0.5 so it centers it. There you go. And now you get some cool looking shapes. And I can keep messing with the noise. I might make it a bit smaller, 0.3. Maybe I'm an idiot and I did it the wrong way. Yep. Yeah, this should go up. So this should be 2, something like that. Yeah. And you can keep screwing around with the scatter to get better or worse results. That looks pretty cool already. I might stop there. You can keep screwing around with it. But the final thing I want to mention, well actually 2 things. One is adding color. To get the colors, I just added an age attribute. So in here you can do something like age plus the current time increment. And that will just give it an attribute of how old it is in seconds from the start of when it spawned into the sim. To color that, you can just use like a color node, set it to ramp from attribute, set it to age, and then you can use some fancy looking color scheme like this, give it a bit more interesting look. Another way you can do this, and the way that I did it, was using a bit of Vex again. There's a function called, I think, HSV to RGB, and that takes like a hue saturation value, converts it to a color. For the hue, you can use the age, saturation 1, color 1, and I'll set that to the color. And that's going a bit too crazy because this is getting pretty big. So I'm going to reduce that down a bit, 0.1. And then you get a bit more control over the colors that you want. And it also repeats automatically, so it'll cycle back, because this node doesn't really repeat. It just stops at red and then cuts off. The other thing that helps is if you don't want to visualize it as points, you can always go copy to points and add in like a sphere. You can set this to be packed, and that will give you a bit more control over the size, and then you can have more luck if you want to render it or something like that. Then I guess I could add a bit more noise to make it look a bit more interesting. So I'll set the noise to be a bit higher, maybe noise times 10, something like that. That's a bit too crazy. So yeah, I kept fucking around with the settings for a bit until I realized that the reason it looked kind of shit was because the noise was too strong, and I needed to add more to the position outwards. So I increased the outward force and I reduced the amount of noise. Yeah, so you can download this file on my website if you want, and thanks for watching. Peace.